Hello and welcome to the debut episode of Sterne, a new talk show about journalism and politics here on HAPS. I'm your host, Peter Sterne. Since this is our first episode, I want to start by telling you a little about my background and the format of the show. I've worked for the past 7 years off and on as a media reporter. That means I've covered the business and culture of American journalism. My first full-time job was as a staff reporter at Politico, where I wrote about the rise of digital media companies like BuzzFeed and Gawker and the struggle of legacy news organizations like the New York Times to adapt to the internet. After the 2016 election, I left Politico to join a nonprofit organization called Freedom of the Press Foundation, and I helped to launch the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, a website that documents threats to journalists in the United States. I've interviewed dozens of journalists who have been arrested or physically attacked while trying to do their jobs, often while covering street demonstrations. Throughout my career as a media reporter, both reporting on the business of media and on journalists under threat, I've realized that many people outside the journalism industry don't understand exactly what it is that reporters and editors actually do all day, how the media business really works, and the kinds of pressures and threats that reporters often face. People in the industry come to learn distinctions that are not necessarily obvious to outsiders, like the difference between a staff reporter at a newspaper and a freelance columnist, or the difference between an off-the-record source and an anonymous source. My goal with Sterne is to help people get a fuller understanding of American journalism. Each week, I'll start off with some quick takes on recent media and politics news before transitioning into a main segment focused on one particular aspect of journalism. This week, the main topic I'll be taking a stern look at is White House reporting. I'll be joined by two professional journalists, Hunter Walker of Yahoo News and Ben Jacobs, previously of the Guardian newspaper. They have worked as White House correspondents during the Trump administration. And under the Trump administration, the White House daily briefing, which started under the Clinton administration, has been curtailed as Trump has taken to bypassing the press and trying to speak directly to his audience over Twitter. Through different press secretaries under the Trump administration, the White House briefing has gone back and forth. Sometimes it's been a daily briefing, other times it's been suspended for years at a time. We'll start off by talking with Ben Jacobs, who has been covering the Trump administration since Trump was a candidate in 2015, and who worked as a White House correspondent in, I believe, 2016 and 2017. Is that correct, Ben?
It's 2017, 2018.
2017, 2018, since Trump was inaugurated in 2017. So first off, Ben, can you tell me what is it like covering the Trump administration, and what was it like to be a White House correspondent?
Well, covering the Trump administration, it's like covering the Trump campaign, which is different from covering any other political entity in which you're covering a level of infighting and transparency in sources that you don't have otherwise. That normally covering other campaigns, other issues, that folks are all rowing in the same direction. There's a common goal. Here, there's less so of that, and you have a level of infighting that creates all these juicy leaks that we get to this day. But it's also indicative of a lack of stability and policy unity as well. And covering the White House itself is not terribly glamorous. It is one of the least appetizing spaces you can ever be in. The White House briefing room itself is a converted swimming pool, and there's very limited office space within the White House. That there's sort of tiny booths for TV networks and a handful of desks. But for the most part, the White House is not really a place to work. And it's a very sort of crammed, claustrophobic space that lacks absolutely any and all glamour. That as you have to go back and forth to do anything, to leave the premises through security and staying in it, squeezing in a tight space where there is any space where the options is to eat would be vending machine tuna fish.
So, what do White House correspondents do all day? Do they just hang out in the briefing room? What do they do if there is no briefing or when a briefing is over?
Well, that when their briefing is over, that they're not there. That the traditional sort of run of folks to the White House would be for a press briefing. If you want to go back to the most traditional part of the Trump administration, which was 2017, and it's still sort of strange to view the Sean Spicer era as a model of traditional values, that you'd have your roughly daily briefing to people, run in and run out, because otherwise there's not much to do there unless you're going in and meeting with folks in the building. Doing that, then you're otherwise dealing with having phone conversations, sourcing conversations elsewhere, and that there's no obvious reason to be in the space, in the brief room space, unless you have some desk space there, you have a place to work, because there is no place to work. And it's not like Capitol Hill where everyone's easy and accessible, that there's an entirely different process to have to talk to folks.
So it seems like what most people see of White House reporting is the briefing. You have reporters in the briefing room asking questions of the press secretary. Sometimes the press secretary is hostile towards the reporters. It's a kind of theater. We've seen it parodied on Saturday Night Live. But what about the parts of the job that most people don't see? Like, other than the theater, what is it actually like to be a White House correspondent? You spoke earlier about reporters going and interviewing people. Like, are there a lot of off-the-record conversations with the press secretary or other people in the press secretary's office? Do people kind of wander the halls of the White House looking for people to interview? How does that work?
There's less of the ability to wander the halls. That at some point there's sort of deep space accessible to reporters without being shot by Secret Service, is divided into what's called lower press and upper press. Upper press is sort of more senior press officials, and lower press is more junior. And that, there's certainly the ability to go into the lower press area. The upper press, Hunter would give a more recent view of this. Has certainly gotten more restrictive. That I remember early on the Trump administration, folks, 20 people camped outside Sean Spicer's office trying to figure out what had happened with Michael Flynn. But that has been cut down, and that at this point there's enough going on where you're reaching out to folks elsewhere in the administration, elsewhere in Trump world, that this is obviously not a traditional hierarchical administration. And it's an entirely different set of organizing.
Can you speak to what you mean about the idea of a traditional hierarchical administration? I mean, I think like sort of your classic administration would be, the Clinton administration when the White House daily televised press briefing started, then the Obama administration, and probably the Biden administration, where you have a professional press operation that is maybe trying to advance the president's interests and stay on the same page.
And to certainly folks advancing their own interests in sort of the level of infighting and sort of gratuitous insanity you can get oftentimes in the Trump administrations, where folks are at each other's throats all the time. And that it's sort of the much more sort of boring traditional idea of what an administration looks like and what happens, which is significantly less transparent, that you don't have situations in which you suddenly, have to ask people to comment on tweets from the president that they've never seen before, comments that it's a much more boring, banal sort of situation, which, certainly makes reporters' jobs in some ways easier, but also makes it much duller as well.
But what is it like to cover an administration that has, demonized the press? I mean, it seems like the Trump administration, there are some advantages over a more professional administration because there's greater transparency, because when people are at each other's throats, they're more willing to leak things and kind of tell you what's going on. But then there's also this hostility to the press that you don't see from a traditional administration?
Not necessarily that you don't see from a traditional administration, but that you see more transparently, more openly doing that you can go back through, issues with the Obama administration press and with subpoenaing reporters. There's an entire thing there. Here it's much more, open, looking for reporters to fight, reporters looking to pick the fights, because as it turns into a little bit more of, that in some ways it's more intense, but in other ways there are also elements that are more like professional wrestling, that there's a little bit of kayfabe to all of us in a way that you don't necessarily see in the past. I mean, there are real issues, obviously, with the press and, the president's and the administration's attitude towards the press, but some of it is also, is also sort of deliberate. It's a kayfabe, for lack of a better word, that it really is a sort of weird storyline, picking the drama, turning CNN into the enemy of the people in a way that, doesn't reflect, a president who obsessively watches cable news TV, and that, this is creating a storyline and a hero and villain for both sides, and, it makes better television.
Yeah, I think that's a good point and a fair point about the way that, in particular, the briefing is a kind of theater, and it always has been. But there are also real effects of the president's hostility to the media. And I don't just mean, him inciting people to attack the press, but it seems like the Trump administration has actually taken steps to try to prevent reporters that they don't like from covering the White House, which is unusual. I mean, traditionally, it seems like journalists themselves have governed who is able to cover the White House through the White House Correspondents Association. Yes. So can you speak to both how reporters generally get credentials to cover the White House, and also how the Trump administration has tried to abuse that process to get rid of reporters they don't like?
So part of it is that reporters go through there's a credentialing process where you apply to get a hard pass, the formal pass to the White House that can take a very long time through a bureaucratic process. But normally once you had the pass, it was good for however long you get it renewed. The Trump administration has mandated that folks have to be on the premises, I think, 90 out of 180 days, which creates a lot of hardship when there isn't actually news going there. It makes it harder for people to get in and out, and changes the criteria for that. It also certainly encourages folks who just want to show up, because one of the sort of signifiers of the White House press briefings is that the White House is a very easy place to get credentialed for, and you have all sorts of random folks who show up from random outlets, for unclear reasons. And sort of one of the great traditions of White House press briefings in less conflicted times was, asking one of those reporters. For example, there's a reporter for a website in India where, when the question would get particularly brief, calling on him and getting a question that had something to do with trade in Kashmir than whatever the heated news of the day would be. You've seen the restrictions there, and you've also had the lawsuit with Jim Acosta. You've had all these restrictions to sort of make more further limit what's going on and who's there, which has created some tensions, and it's over really particularly sort of minor reasons. That obviously the fight over Jim Acosta didn't accomplish any particular good, and was sort of fighting for the sake of fighting, and picking a fight with CNN for the sake of picking the fight with CNN, because it certainly wasn't necessarily about reporting. And you've seen there are always some of these tensions that are inherent in all of this, but sort of seen it break down in the most least subtle ways possible.
So in general, if the president is not specifically targeting you and trying to take away your credential, would you say it is relatively easy for any journalist to just cover the White House and go to the press briefing?
Not these days. I mean, if you're talking about a few years ago would be, that they're sort of now dealing with this. They're now further restrictions because of the pandemic. That
Right.
keep in mind that none of this has been normal at this part for nearly a year, and doesn't look like it'll get normal anytime soon. That it's more difficult to get in there, and more difficult to do the process. But it's also a question of what the value is of going to the briefing for the sake of going to a briefing. If that's someone's motivation.
Yeah, I mean, how many journalists are generally allowed in the briefing room? How pre-pandemic, and how has that changed? Are they trying to social distance now?
Yeah, there are no limitations in the briefing room before then. So you'd have the folks in the assigned chairs. I believe they're 36 or 48, and you have people piled up on the walls to each side, trying to ask questions. At this point, there's sort of very specific things, and there's sort of unique rotations within the rotations of the pool. And they've tried to say, only if you have a seat, if you're part of this rotation, just to try to minimize folks there. And of course, there have been exceptions that once OAN showed up, that you've had a couple of other reporters who've showed up for these things, because the White House Correspondents Association can't enforce this. Is asking to get a reporter for Economic Times. You had a reporter for Playboy starting to show up and sort of trying to take advantage of this and get in their punches, because the code, it's only as good as everyone sticking to it.
So it's voluntary compliance about whether people are wearing masks in the briefing room?
About whether people show up. I mean, wearing masks is also voluntary. Everyone has been, and that you sort of saw an initial reluctance for folks to wear masks and for folks to do that, which gradually went away. Though you still had, folks take off their masks when they're asking questions and folks doing that. But there's no official enforcement policy other than, with OANN, they lost their ability to rotate into one of the chairs, which doesn't particularly matter much in the short term when you're allowed to show up whenever you want with permission.
Well, and I think that brings up another good point about how the Trump era press briefing and White House correspondence have changed from previous eras, which is that I know you talked before that about how people from relatively small or obscure publications have always been able to attend the White House briefing. It's not that difficult to get a press credential. But it seems like under the Trump administration, there's been a rise in people from, I guess, right-wing conspiracy sites or very pro-Trump sites that are not necessarily journalists attending the White House press briefing and getting called on by the president and asking him questions that are designed to glorify him. You've seen this with OANN, the One American News Network. You've also seen it with, real conspiracy sites like the Gateway Pundit.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and Gateway Pundit, I don't know if they've shown up recently. They had a moment where they showed up very early on, which was sort of as much about trolling. And I think it stood up because these folks have always been there, that you can think back to early in the Trump's first press conference in the East Room, where he took a question from a 19-year-old blogger from New Jersey. That there's always been folks who are not traditionally in those mix there, but it's become much clearer during the pandemic where the access has been reduced. And, folks from papers like the New York Times or the Washington Post aren't necessarily going to actually be able to be there every day, but you have OAN there showing up every day, and that it stands out when they're sort of getting unique treatment, not sort of abiding by the code. And they would have had some access to it anyway. But that when you're 1 in 12 rather than 1 in 100, that stands out. And I think the pandemic has created this new space in which these outlets who are not playing by the same rules as everyone else are using that to take advantage of things.
And that's partly because the White House Correspondents Association, this sort of voluntary group that regulates the White House correspondents, has asked people not to physically attend the briefings?
Yes, they've asked that, trying to minimize who's attending and who's going there. Don't go into the White House unless you have to attend it when there's a briefing. There's a rotation for whose day it is, so that, outlets have their opportunities within that, so that, people are excluded. but there's limited opportunity there. And the White House Correspondents Association is voluntary. It's sort of voluntary compliance, and you've seen some of this in terms of even how the briefing is done, going back to the beginning when traditionally the first question of the briefing was to the AP. And then the briefing would go on until the reporters were out of questions, not until the press secretary decided they were tired of talking. And that this it shifted more and more to this being something that's being dictated by the administration press shop, rather than voluntary, sort of a voluntary cooperative effort, in terms of the White House, in terms of the briefing, the White House Correspondents Association, because traditionally the White House itself didn't want to get involved in this, that if you're trying to assign people seats or trying to take turns doing that, there's no upside to doing that and playing favorites within the press corps. And that's at least...
Yeah, it seems like traditionally the White House, did not want to interfere with what the journalists were doing, because they valued this idea of journalistic independence. The journalists should be able to decide who gets to go to the White House press briefing. But the Trump administration has tried to influence it because they don't care about journalistic independence.
Well, it's not just, I think, caring about that, but whether it was worth their time or whether it was worth their effort too. That getting to this level of nitty-gritty, that you didn't have previous presidents of both parties spending, significant portions of the day watching cable news. That it's not just about journalistic independence, but is this the fight that you want to pick? Is this an investment of your time that's worth expending the energy? That George W. Bush or Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, they had other fish to fry. This was
right. It wasn't like the press secretary was the most important person in the administration in previous administrations. They were not the one person that the president really paid attention to.
That if you go back into past administrations, it's hard to name most White House press secretaries. That the average person, that if you back the long-serving White House press secretary Marlon Fitzwater, has the name ID, 1,000 people. There was polling at one point in 2017 where Sean Spicer had higher name ID than Elizabeth Warren. That in the fact that you can now name these people in the White House, that people know, Sean Spicer is going to be forever a celebrity in the way that any other White House press secretary isn't.
Right.
Changes the dynamics, and the same thing with Sarah Sanders, with Kayleigh McEnany, that these are folks who are as much cable news talking heads as sort of actual press officials.
All right. Now, I want to go and talk to Hunter, who has been patiently waiting. Hunter, thank you for joining us. Now, you are currently, I see you've got the wine. You are currently a White House correspondent for Yahoo News, right?
That is correct. Last I checked.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, it probably
I haven't heard
changed,
from my editor in a couple hours. Let's not tempt fate here, Peter.
And when was the last time you went to the White House press briefing room? Because as Ben said, the White House Correspondents Association has encouraged people not to attend the briefings.
Right. So I can tell you exactly. The last day that I was in the White House was November 20th. And that was the day that Mike Pence came in for what was ostensibly a coronavirus task force briefing. Ben is totally right. It's gotten very complicated. We are trying to implement social distancing. So normally I would be at the White House a couple times a week, but I'm now part of a complex internal rotation where basically one of the seats in the briefing room, I am one of the reporters who needs to occupy it, in an alphabetical order, depending on when the briefing was. So this slot was mine. And the last time I was there before that was November 4th, the day after the election. And I was the pooler that day. So that's another rotation that I'm on.
Yeah, that is something I wanted to kind of talk about, because I think it's something that a lot of people not in the industry, or really people who are not in, political reporters, don't necessarily understand this idea of pooling and of rotation. So can you explain first what is the White House pool and what is its purpose, and then how the White House pool differs from this new sort of social distanced rotation idea?
So there are multiple White House pools. That's the first thing. I am part of the print pool as a writer for a website. There's also a television pool, a radio pool, a wire pool, because each different medium has its own needs and priorities for what they're getting from the White House. But the general purpose is that anytime the president is active at work and particularly out and about, there's a reporter with them. And, quite frankly, some of the reason for this is in case there's an emergency. I mean, my colleague Olivier Knox was travel pooler on Air Force One, and my former colleague Olivier Knox not on 9/11. And he ended up on the plane, for an extended period with the president. And you have reporters with the president almost at all times until they basically declare a lid and go to bed. And this term lid became politicized and sort of a feature of Trump's campaign as he was arguing that Biden was not as active as he was. But these systems are set up so that reporters are with the president at all times. So if anything of consequence happens, there's someone there to transmit that news to the people. And in addition to the different types of pooling for every medium, there is what's called the in-town pool. So that's me and other reporters in DC who accompany the president anytime he's in the general metro area of the nation's capital. Then there's the domestic travel pool. So those are seats on Air Force One. I fill one of those, go to different rallies with the president, different domestic trips. I was there with him when he went to Mount Rushmore for the fireworks extravaganza ahead of July 4th. And then there's also the international travel pool. These are the reporters who go on foreign trips with the president. So all these rotations are happening at once. Then there's the normal, I believe, 48 seats in the briefing room. One of those is assigned to each different outlet. Yahoo has one of the seats. We're the second to last row, all the way on the left. But in the age of COVID, as we again have attempted, at least as a press corps, to look out for each other and implement social distancing at the White House, we've spaced out the seats in the briefing room. So everyone who did have a seat is instead part of this temporary rotation. So for me, in the past month, I've actually only been at the White House twice. Once was on November 4th, the day after the election. I went down there as the main print pooler, and we did not see the president once that day. So essentially, I went down, took a COVID test in case I got called into the room with him, and literally nothing happened. The next time I went down there was 16 days later on the 20th, and this is when Pence came out for this task force briefing. And it was really one of the first times, I mean, that day, November 4th, began a long stretch post-election where the president didn't face the press at all. Right? This was even before the weird 1-minute appearance he had in the briefing room. Pence sort of tested the waters and held this Corona briefing. We all watched it, as we do with every task force briefing, assuming that they would take questions afterwards. And even though this was ostensibly a press briefing, which normally does feature questions, Pence, Birx, Fauci, General Perna, who's involved in vaccine distribution, even though they were talking about matters as crucial as where the vaccine is in development and how we're all going to get it, they didn't take any questions. And they walked out of the room, and I was one of the reporters who stood up and essentially shouted at them, asking the questions we had wanted to ask and trying to get them to be accountable to the American people.
So right now, due to the social distancing, where you have the rotations of the seats, how many people are supposed to be in the briefing room now?
I don't have the total number. It's normally 48 seats. It's reduced from full rows to one or two a row. I would say, actual correspondence in the chairs, you have a dozen-ish down from 48. There's also a lot of support staff. I mean, the TV folks have their cameramen, they have producers. And then as Ben, was mentioning earlier, OAN has gotten in trouble. This is the conservative channel.
Right. That's One American News Network, one of Trump's favorite TV networks now.
And a place that has gone as far as any conspiracy outlet in attempting to undermine and spread false narratives about the election that just took place. And one thing that they've done is, despite this social distancing rotation, Chanel Ryan, their White House correspondent, and I use that term so loosely, has continually come in the briefing room and sort of stood in the back, had her mask off, and tried to ask questions. And it's galling to me because she's putting, White House staff, reporters, and their families at risk, but also she's not asking any questions that have any news value. Right. One of the ones that I remember off the top of my head, she was asking about this incident where Antifa.com, this random website, was redirecting to Joe Biden's campaign webpage. And anyone who knows literally anything about website development knows that, I can redirect to a third-party page with no involvement from them. It's literally a meaningless thing. And in fact, I subsequently did a story. I found out that Antifa.com was registered, guess where? Russia. And, that doesn't necessarily, website registration. I could register a website via Panama or Russia right now, but it was one hell of a coincidence. And she was certainly bringing, potentially foreign material into the briefing room, implying it meant something it didn't. And, just being the epitome of disinformation while also, putting everyone at risk of COVID exposure.
And in talking about the different sort of, reporters who attend these briefings and who cover the president, you mentioned the White House pool. Now, is everyone who has a credential or who is usually attending the briefing in the White House pool? Like, would OANN ever be in the White House pool where they would be the one following the president?
So the White House pool is administered by the White House Correspondents Association. They also administer the seats. They administer these various different pools. They have pretty rigid criterion for membership, which are also designed to eliminate organizations that have, foreign government funding or engage in lobbying. So they have a pretty high standard. But again, there's these multiple rotations and it gets pretty complicated. You can have people who work for one of the organizations that are in the pool but don't normally cover the White House, and they show up on a given moment. So, for example, I've gotten a couple pool days that are, a Saturday or a Sunday when the president's about to go play golf and there's not a lot of news happening. And you can find yourself on those pool days with a freelancer, who's just given a temporary day pass, by an organization like Bloomberg or the New York Times that knows that they have kind of an off hours weird pool shift to fill. For me, I go in every day that I can, and I've learned, frankly, the hard way that you kind of always have to be prepared when you're on the grounds of the White House. I mean, I'm someone who used to cover news in New York. Yahoo brought me down to DC to cover Trump. So I'd never even been in the White House as a tourist. And all of a sudden I find myself covering the president in the briefing. And I learned within that first week or so that literally every time you walk in the White House, you should be prepared potentially to talk to the president and have a question. And I say that because, as Ben pointed out, it did get more restricted over time. And the Trump administration sort of learned this stuff. But there used to be this hallway that he would walk past every evening. He used to take a route from the Oval to the residence that would pass the press area. And the first time I saw this happening, I was standing there waiting to talk to someone else, and the president just walked by me. And I hadn't really mentally prepared for that, even though I knew sort of what my questions for the day were. And all I could blurt out was, "Hello, Mr. President." And I have tried every other time I've been in the White House to be 100% prepared what I would ask him and what I would ask any member of his team, because you really don't know. I mean, one thing that's happened in the Trump administration, even in recent days, as he's sort of tried to avoid very traditionally and directly facing the press post-election, they've put out very, very rapid notice for his events. So when he did make that 1 minute long appearance in the briefing room, I think reporters got 2 minute warning that that was happening. So that meant that like whoever was on the rotation for that given day wasn't necessarily in place at the White House or in the briefing room and couldn't necessarily get there. So you really do always have to be on your toes, particularly when your position is up in one of these rotations.
And so can you talk a little about, I guess this is sort of relevant, this idea of, being in the White House when the president might just walk past you and you'd have to ask him a question, or when other people who are in the news and in the administration, walk past you. What is it like to be a White House correspondent outside of briefing? How do you approach people? How do you try to ask people, both, principals like the president and lower level staffers, what is going on? What is all the stuff that ordinary people don't see that goes into White House reporting?
Well, first, let's understand, what press access at the White House means. And one thing that didn't come up before is, to get on the White House complex, and it is a complex that includes, the East Wing, which is largely the residence and sort of the ceremonial entertaining quarters, the office of the First Lady. There's then the West Wing, which actually includes the Oval Office and is sort of the business end of the White House. And actually, I always point this out when family and friends visit DC, that building with the columns, the sort of iconic White House, that's the East Wing. The actual West Wing is kind of the low-lying building that's next door to it. And the press briefing room is kind of the little connector between the two. It is, as Ben said, in what used to be the pool, which is where the name the press pool comes from. The complex also includes the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, the old Executive Office Building, which is, the main headquarters for the Vice President, although he does have an office in the West Wing, but it's also where the bulk of the executive branch staff are located. So if you have a White House pass, and there are multiple levels to that, you can have a dedicated hard pass. I do have one of those. That means that, right now, if I wanted to go to the White House, I would run downtown, swipe in, I have it hanging there. I don't need to give them any notice. I'm ready to go. Other reporters can apply to get a single day pass or a 6-month pass. And I think that's more what Ben was alluding to. Those have been going out for a long time to a wide range of outlets. And as much as I might criticize something like OAN, I think, it is a good thing for our country, for the media generally, that a large number of people have traditionally been able to access the White House. It is the people's house after all, and we like people to have access to it. So that being said, when you're there in a given day, you're able to access this upper and lower press that Ben was talking about. If you're pool, you might be brought into the Oval or where the president is. If you're not pool, basically you can hang out on the yard, sort of on the I believe it is the north lawn of the White House. You can sit in the briefing room. If you have workspace there, you can sit in your workspace. But you're not really getting a ton of time to interact with people unless you have those chance encounters. The bulk of my work actually occurs right here at my desk in my house, because I'm just calling sources all the time. They don't necessarily want to speak to me while I'm at the White House. In fact, the work days often go very late because they don't even want to talk during work hours. You're basically going to the White House when you have a specific meeting with someone, when you're covering an event like pool or the briefing, or really are looking for someone to pigeonhole when they won't answer your calls. But the bulk of our work, I would say, occurs, during off-campus meetings and phone calls.
And can you talk more about what it is like to be a pooler? Like, what exactly does that entail? I mean, we have this idea. I actually did not know that the White House press pool was named the pool because it used to be in a swimming pool. But when you talked about what it means to be in the press pool, this idea that you want someone from each media type to be with the president at all times. You have a print pooler, you have a TV pooler, you have like a photography pooler. And what exactly does a pooler do? Like, you follow the president, and if he has a heart attack, you report on it. But if he doesn't have a heart attack, what do you do? Like, what is a pool dispatch?
Well, first off, Beluga Blues 10, nice to see you. I can see your questions. And if you have one, put one there in the comments. I had to pour myself another glass of wine when you asked that question, Peter, because pooling is such a funny thing. It is simultaneously totally exciting and an honor, but it's also absolutely one of the most terrifying things I've ever done. And here's what I mean by that, right? When we talk about pool, we're essentially talking about being people's eyes and ears on the president, right? So typically what you'll do is this: you send out a pool report, and there's a whole jargon that's involved in it. You might say, like, you use the royal we a lot. You refer to yourself as your pooler, because again, you're not even a person, you're representing the whole group. And I should note, I have no experience with radio, wire, or TV pool. So I don't know what their reports look like. They need to send out different materials, including in the case of radio, what they're largely sending out, I believe, is just like raw audio of any time someone speaks. For the print pooler, you basically say, I've arrived at the White House. They give you a call time the night before. You let people know when you're there. And then they basically will call a lid, either the full lid for the day or a lunch lid, which is like a temporary break when there's no activity. At any other point, you're on call. You don't know how much warning you're going to get. And you will either get pulled into a scheduled or unscheduled event. I want to put one caveat in there. I think there's also a photo pool, again, making sure that all the services have pictures of the president for any given thing. But, it's a lot of hurry up and wait. It's almost like being a fireman, right? Like, you're sort of sitting there all day. If nothing's on the schedule, you might have a day like I did November 4th, where you go in, you say, I got here in the morning. And then at the end of the day, you call a lid and nothing happened. Or you might have a day where, especially with President Trump, I mean, one thing about him, as he curtailed the briefing, as he held less sort of traditional press conferences for long stretches of his administration, there was one level in which he was far more transparent than any prior president. And that was direct engagement with reporters. He had these sort of freewheeling things where he would just take questions. I think most famously on the South Lawn, whenever he was leaving for Marine One, we knew he would walk by and he might talk to the entire crush of reporters. And that was open to anyone who was in the White House that day. Or he might sort of hold forth its pool sprays. So that's kind of like what everyone saw the other day when he was kind of behind that tiny desk. That was the diplomatic room where he typically signs bills and and when they bring you in for a ceremony like that, or an executive order signing in the Oval Office, in Trump's case, he would afterwards kind of open the floor up to questions from the pool. And no other president did that. But
it seems like traditionally, when you would bring in the pool for that kind of thing, like a bill signing, the idea was basically like, it's a photo op. You want to get a photo of the president signing this bill. The idea of sort of turning it into an impromptu press conference was something that Trump really did.
It's totally Trump. It's one of the many ways he destroyed the playbook. I think part of what happened, through my conversations with sources and other people close to him, he's a guy who is a creature of the New York City tabloids. He's a creature of reality television. And he's a brand machine, right? Like, if you read the New York Times reporting on his tax returns and look at his financial disclosures, his biggest business has not necessarily been real estate. It has been his own brand as a mogul. And say whatever you will about the guy, he is an absolute marketing genius and a master media manipulator. And I think particularly early on, he was frustrated with his press secretaries. They were getting bad reviews, and he felt like, you know what? I am my own best salesman. And so on Twitter and in these kind of freewheeling events, he sought to speak directly to the people, even if that was antagonistic with the press. And getting back to what I was starting with, the idea that pool is both exciting and terrifying. I mean, first off, no matter what happens there, whether it's COVID exposure or any of the negative things that can come with it, I feel like the day I am not excited and honored to walk into the White House, I need to quit my job. It's impossible not to walk into a space like the briefing room or the Oval Office and not feel the weight of history and essentially the burden. I mean, for me, I'm a guy from Brooklyn. I had no connections in this industry. I went to public school. Like I know friends of mine have things in their life that are serious and matter to them. And I view myself as the person who's there in the White House asking questions for other people. So that burden is an incredible honor, and it's incredibly exciting, but also particularly when you're pool, not only do you have that, duty of being America's voice in there to question the president, but sometimes you are literally the first and only transmitter of what's going on. What do I mean? When Trump's having a freewheeling, pool spray session in the Oval Office, right? He's sometimes talking for 20 or 30 minutes on massively news breaking things, such as his relationship with rivals, such as, where he sits on, potentially passing something like a COVID stimulus bill. And you're getting these transmissions from him, but keep in mind that the TV and the radio people, they're not broadcasting live, right? I remember, there was this day recently, sort of after the president was sick, when he came back to the White House, and we were all watching that shot on the lawn, and we were not watching him speak live. We watched it later. The reason is because, there's not technology yet for TV and radio people to live stream from those locations. So the print and wire reporters sending out quick emails of, the president just said this, the president just said that. That is the first draft of history. And that's an incredible burden. And it can also happen, especially as travel pool. I mean, thank God there was not more news when the president went to South Dakota for the 4th of July celebration, because when we were on Mount Rushmore for fireworks, the weather was bad and I couldn't get emails out for an extended period. So literally I was watching the president. My memory and the drafts in my phone were the only record of what was happening, and it wasn't out to anyone else until I had service. And that often happens, when you're on Air Force One, if he speaks to you in back of the plane, there's no reception, particularly on the smaller plane, and you have to get that out after the fact. Or weird things like there's also a local pool called in for some travel events. So like if the president visits Minneapolis, the Star Tribune might send someone there. When I worked in New York at the Observer, I was pooler when Obama visited Staten Island after Sandy. And due to the hurricane, there was no phone reception on Staten Island. So Obama was saying stuff, Obama was doing stuff. And until my phone connected to the internet and sent that out, people didn't know what had happened. And that's exciting. It's cool, but it's also terrifying, because if you get a word wrong, you can move the markets. If you get a word wrong, you can increase international tensions. It's really, really, really super intense. I just want to say, I see Beluga Blues 10 is in there with a question. They said, what's the thing that people don't usually see behind the scenes? I think I touched on some of that, but I will share one last thing, which is my favorite weird behind the scenes thing at the White House. So I have been on Air Force Two and I have been on Air Force One. And when you go on these trips with the president or vice president, and I never did this pre-Trump administration, so I only know about Trump and Pence, but what they tend to do is when they are boarding the plane, either at Andrews here near DC or, at an airport around the country where they've traveled to, they walk, they salute the Marines at the base of the steps, and then they walk up the steps to board Air Force One. And when they do this, they dramatically wave. And I have come to realize that they do this even when absolutely no one is there. Sometimes they just wave at no one, and it's just so the cameras can get that picture of them boarding the plane and waving as though a large crowd is sending them off. And, I would say the majority of times the airport's pretty much deserted and they are just photo opping and waving at nothing. So I hope that was a good one for you, Beluga Blues 10.
All right. Thank you so much, Hunter. I want to bring Ben back. I want to talk to both of you about your experience covering the White House, and especially sort of the differences that you've noticed. Because one thing that I think is interesting is, Hunter, you are currently a White House correspondent. As you said, you've been the print pooler. You are very much you're a member of the White House Correspondents Association. You're very much someone who is sort of, a White House correspondent. Whereas, Ben, you've continued to cover the White House and the Trump administration, but you've done so not really as someone in the briefing room or on the pool. So I'm interested in understanding what it's like to report on the White House if, you don't really have that access and you're just relying on calling up sources. And Hunter, you as well, you talked about how a lot of your job, aside from being a White House correspondent and being a pooler who can report on whatever the president is doing, really is based on reaching out to sources. That's how you find out what's actually going on, not just what the president is saying and doing. So I really want to bring you both on to talk about that. Although, we'll go with that first, and then I'll talk more about some of the specific reporting that you've done. And I'll also say to everyone who is watching at home, if you have any questions, please, if you're a member of HAPS, you can comment. If you're watching on Twitter or Facebook or Reddit, if you send a comment, we will see it and we can respond to it. And because this show is all about helping people understand what it's like to be a journalist, particularly what it's like to be a White House correspondent, we want to hear from you. We really want to know what you're interested in, what questions you have for these professional journalists. So with that, I will bring Ben back on, and let's just talk about what is it like. What?
I said, what's up, Ben?
Yeah, Ben, how you doing?
Ben and I go way back. We may or may not have drunk wine together in this very dark room that I'm in right now, but that's another story for a far different broadcast.
Let's keep it family friendly, Hunter. But yeah, I think in terms of covering the White House, that look, being part of the poll, someone who's been on, the plane, was the poll reporter. The one-time reporters were on the plane during the campaign with then candidate Trump on his own private plane. It's a different thing, but that you don't necessarily need to do it. That, one of the best White House reporters of the Trump administration is Jonathan Swan of Axios. They don't have a seat in the briefing room. They're not part of the regular poll rotation. They're still.
They got at it. They are part of it now.
They are part of it now. I know but that you don't necessarily need to do it. That part of it is about the formal process of it and being familiar with the formal process of it. That these are differences between the reporting, that being in the poll and being in the briefing room gives you a sense of the formal moments of the presidency and sort of these set pieces rather than the craziness that's happening outside. And that balance may be entirely different under President Biden than it has been under President Trump and what's going on, because obviously you're not going to have this unique culture around it. It's going to be a much more traditional thing. But look, part of it is having been in that position in the first place is helpful, is that I know how this works and know how this stuff works. But this is not something where I've started this process from scratch by just, being a guy calling up people randomly. That as long as that you don't necessarily need to be there, but you need, as long as you understand how it works and understand the mechanics and where it all fits in.
And one thing that I'm sort of curious about, you've both alluded to this idea of calling up sources trying to figure out what is going on in the administration. And we've seen, you see the New York Times, you see the Washington Post. They often write these stories that are reporting on what's called palace intrigue, right? Like, what is going on inside the Trump administration? What is Trump actually doing every day? Is he in the bathrobe watching Fox, or I guess now Newsmax and OANN? When people are at each other's throats and they're leaking things, what is it actually like talking to administration officials, either off the record or on background? And I'd also be interested if you can explain the difference between those. Like, how does the sausage get made for White House reporting in the Trump era?
God, this is a really great question, Peter. Before we tackle it, I just want to double back on something Ben said. I think he very accurately noted that you don't need access to the briefing room in the pool to cover the White House. I mean, I think famously Maggie Haberman is pretty much the best reporter on the Trump beat, and she has never moved out of New York, right? The action is, as I was alluding to earlier, largely off campus. What you get on campus is sort of the formal official message of the White House. You can try your best to punch through that with a sharp question, but you are by and large getting a staged production, lighting and all. I mean, keep in mind the president has an official photographer. There's an official White House media outlet that kind of tapes the things that you might see, such as the First Lady's recent Christmas video. And these events are by and large staged for that. The reporter questions are sometimes a nuisance. I mean, I was pooler the day the president left Walter Reed. And, basically they staged movie studio lamps outside of the hospital and clearly had this plan to film a whole video of him kind of walking out of the hospital and triumphantly returning to the White House. I ended up, as he walked past us outside of the White House, asking him if he was worried he'd been super spreading. Somehow that scene was cut from the official documentary. But, you're very much seeing the production of the White House, not the palace intrigue and the inner workings. And I don't think, so I don't think it's safe to assume that anyone in the briefing or anyone in the pool has access. It's also not safe to assume you have access if you're on the phone, right? Part of the reason I ended up covering President Trump is that throughout the 2016 election, he used to call me constantly. He used to email me. The way he would email is there was a secretary at the Trump organization who would print out emails that were sent to him. He would read them on paper, write his responses in Sharpie. She would scan them back in and then email a PDF to whoever he was corresponding to. And I was in this routine. I ended up doing a long interview with him that basically got known for a moment where I asked him if he would consider putting Muslims in a database or registry. He was clearly open to it. We reported it as such. Amazingly, after I did the interview, he told me it was great. He told me he loved it. He followed up the next day. He told me he loved it. When those quotes became a huge controversy, he literally never spoke to me again outside of a large scrum. And I watched my even outside unofficial access to Trump world, shrink down to nothing. That being said, I have still found I've been able to cover this entity that in the era of President Trump, a lot of us have termed quote unquote Trump world or the president's orbit, because he had this unusually large circle of official and unofficial advisors, people like Chris Ruddy from Newsmax, who are regularly on the phone with him, no position at the White House, current and former campaign aides. There would be people like Steve Bannon who one day were on the outs and one day were back in. So a reporter could develop individual relationships with these sort of more fringe characters and start to get a good sense of what was going on in the White House. The problem is, Trump has famously said that even in his business career, he deliberately liked to, take the team of rivals approach almost to a wild extreme, where sort of, he likes people at each other's throats. He feels like it keeps his people competitive, keeps him tough, and also gets him kind of the best opinion as the ultimate arbiter between these warring factions. And that's how he ran the White House. So you have to be very careful as a reporter when one Trump source tells you something. In my mind, I needed at least, 2 to 4 more places. Because so often I've had the experience of a Trump source telling me something and, it's what they hope will happen. It fits their agenda, but another faction in the president's circles saying something else. And really with the president's unique propensity for falsehoods, and the uniquely intense and infighting nature of his administration, you have to have this additional layer of 4 times triple confirmation that I don't think you necessarily needed to have with anything else. I mean, in a traditional White House, if the press secretary told you something, it had a certain level of credibility. If certain people very close to the president told you something, you knew that's where they stood. Whereas, very famously in this White House, there are so many instances of them saying, "Oh, we have confidence in this person," and they got axed 5 minutes later, right? So it was a wider circle that you needed to cover a lot more carefully, and this question of who has access works and or doesn't work on multiple levels.
Well, and again, let's talk about in terms of getting that access and in terms of talking to people. Are people afraid of retaliation? Why do they talk to you? And do they talk to you on background, so it's anonymous, or do they talk to you off the record? And sort of how do you balance that? How do you get people to be willing, if not to put their names to things, at least to allow you to quote them if you keep them anonymous?
I mean, I'm not as charming as Hunter, so I don't know. That has its own challenges, but I think folks obviously, look, we're also in a place where everyone's doing it, and I think folks who would have been reticent about talking to the press earlier in the administration now knows they don't have a choice, because look, this is an administration where the leaking is starting in the Oval Office, and working down. But this is very much by sort of a New York tabloid type of situation. That there's the difference between background and what the background is and what the attribution is in agreeing with someone, so that you are getting something that's appropriate there. And and that's the thing. Background would be a source familiar with Hunter Walker's kitchen, as opposed to off the record, which is something you can use. And once it's said off the record, you can't take the genie out of the bottle, but you certainly have the sense of knowing it, and you can't use it and trusting folks to be reliable that way, and how that works. But
so in general, if someone agrees to tell you something, this is what's actually happening with the administration off the record, that's something that you can't report, but you can use, like, at least it, and you can try to find other people to confirm it.
It informs what you're doing, and obviously depends on what their particular, if there's a question, certainly you get into the nuances of off the record and deep background and not for attribution type of stuff. But generally, it's hard to unring the bell, but it can be useful even if you're not using that. And there's sort of situations with this. This is hard to do without pointing to any examples, because then you violating that. And I see,
what I would say, if I may jump in here, because I see my buddy Beluga Blues 10. I think we got 1,300 people in here, and Beluga Blues 10 is the only one coming in here with the questions, coming in with the fire. But something that really gets to the heart of this: how do we know sources are really real? And it's a particularly important question in the Trump era, because the president, as I was saying earlier, he took this term, the lid, which was this like very technical, insidery White House pool term, and he turned it into like a feature of his 2020 campaign, right? He's also like railed repeatedly against anonymous sources, and folks need to understand what that is. That's not anonymous to us, the reporter. That's anonymous to you. And the reason we would grant anonymity is because someone may have fear of retribution for telling us something. I mean, one story I just happened to be talking about with someone today, when the Rob Porter scandal happened, and this was a top Trump aide who kind of had some domestic abuse issues. An anonymous source in the White House told me that, they thought this was being mishandled because there was a quote unquote boys club in the Trump administration. And I thought that was a really important view. I was able to verify it through multiple sources. And I wanted to convey that story to the public, right? But I couldn't name those people. They would have absolutely been fired. I mean, we've all seen the president's rants against leakers, right? So, typically there will be multiple degrees of a conversation. And keep in mind, right, like this is not set in stone. Every reporter can do what they want, right? Chanel Ryan, as we've already discussed, is doing, sort of propaganda agenda journalism. That's got a totally different set of rules. But
does that have rules at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's a total break with what we would normally do. I went to Columbia J School. I come from a very sort of traditional approach to this, I'd like to think. Well, that being said, I mean, actually, that's a great thing. Like, so traditionally, off record means it didn't happen. Total lockbox. Traditionally, I could meet with someone off record. I could talk with them. It's sort of more of a getting to know you. It's something that might inform my thinking, but I cannot refer to it in any way. On background will be like, I'm talking to someone, they know I'm going to quote it, but I'm not going to refer to them by name. So that will be someone giving me a briefing as a senior administration official, or a source familiar, or a source close to. One of my favorite dealing with the president's larger orbit has been Trump ally, right? In my mind, the ethical line is, if I'm talking to Ben Jacobs or Peter Sterne, I cannot say I just had a conversation with a source close to Peter Sterne, right? That would be actually misrepresenting and obscuring your identity. Other people might handle that differently. I don't know how reporters would handle it. So in that sense, my view of off record and on background is very traditional, where I personally get a little more untraditional. And in a modern environment where, one thing we should understand, I mean, I think we were alluding to earlier the fact that the televised briefing is a creature of the Clinton era, right? But so much of what we see is new, right? And in the old days, reporters used to have extensive direct engagement with the president in the White House. This would largely occur off record. There were gentlemen's agreements to avoid things like reporting on President Kennedy's cheating, right? And they would sort of get together for drinks at the end of the day, and reporters would file their one story and kind of move on, right? Now it's totally different. I like to use more anonymous sourcing than something like the New York Times might be comfortable with, right? But I only like to use it in a way where I feel like I'm telling readers things accurately, and I'm telling them more and not less. And part of that change from the old to the modern is that there are these large crisis communications and PR apparatuses around even low-level politicians that we never saw before. And part of breaking through, a modern workplace where people are spying on email, where people are spying on web browsers, is actually allowing for more anonymous sourcing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely true that not only, like, you see more anonymous sources, but you also, especially under this administration, but even just in general in the modern world, it is much easier to trace communications and retaliate against people. So a lot of people might be willing to tell you something, but not if their name is attached to it. A lot of people might be willing to tell you something off the record, because they think that if you only hear it from them, it will get traced back to them. So they say something like, off the record, this is what happened. If you can hear it from 2 or 3 more sources, then you can report it. But you didn't just hear it from me. Like, there are all these different gradations. Hunter, did we lose you? Okay, Ben, I guess you're center stage now. I see we have more questions from Beluga. This, I think, is a great one if you want to take it. How do you anonymously cite anonymous?
Anonymously cite, and I'm not sure if I follow that one, but
well, I think to go back to what Hunter was saying, like if you have an anonymous source, this is someone who is not anonymous to you. Are there cases in which you learn things from people who are genuinely anonymous to you? Like, do people ever email you and say, like, I've heard this, but I'm not going to tell you who I am?
I've had people try to do that, but that's generally not something you believe. That's happened once or twice, but that's also something where, you know, if I don't know who you are, I can't trust you or verify any of that. That it's certainly something that's been.
So generally speaking, if, you know, someone emails a reporter and says, you know, from like a fake email address, and they're like, I don't want to tell you who I am, but I can tell you this, that is not something that you would print.
No, not in a million years.
Is it something that you might ask other people who might be familiar?
Yeah, I mean, potentially it might be worthwhile as a lead, depending on what it was and what was there. But you know, it's not. I'm not going to take nobody's word for it. You know, that I need to know what it is. And
so again, in all the cases where, certainly you too, but I think we can generally say reporters in general who are covering the White House, when they say that something is according to sources who requested anonymity, that does not mean that they are unknown.
They're 100% known.
Right. So you know who is saying it, and you know if they're in a position to know what they're saying.
Yes.
You know, are they someone who is actually in the meeting? And then once you figure out, is this trustworthy, then you have kind of a separate conversation about how do we attribute this? Because maybe you would know that, you know, this person was in the meeting, so they must know what was said, but you can't actually say they were in the meeting because then they could be traced.
Mm-hmm. That's right, and that's why they're weasel words. They're, you know, familiar with the meeting and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And as Hunter said, you know, some journalists will go even farther and say, like, a person familiar with Trump's thinking when it's actually Trump. And that can be kind of misleading.
I mean, it's hard to, you know, I don't. It's hard to argue many people are familiar with Trump's thinking besides Trump at this point.
Well, that's true. But yeah, I think that's really important for people to understand, because I think a lot of people believe that if they don't know where it's coming from, that also means that the journalist doesn't know where it's coming from. When the truth is that, you know, you have to trust that the journalist is telling you the truth, that they spoke with someone, that they know who it is, that they've sort of done the work to confirm it. But it's not the case that the journalist is as in the dark as the readers.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sorry I ducked off for a second there. My colleague needed my attention. But
is your colleague the dog?
Yes, my colleague is a puggle. But you know, what I would say is that, for me at least, an anonymous source is never anonymous to me. I normally would have, particularly with Trump world, a lot of verification. The only time, there's literally only one time I've ever taken something single sourced. And it was not in the Trump administration. And it was a case where like a meeting had 4 people in it. And knowing that, I wrote around that. I tried to sort of establish that, this was single sourced, but it was a fact where the known universe was so tiny that I had to recognize I had 25% of the people who might have known it. Right. Yeah. So that to me was an excuse to kind of relax my standards. Other things wouldn't be. Ben is absolutely right. I mean, sometimes I have an open tips box that I advertise on Twitter. I opened my DMs because I'm looking for tips. I have heard things from anonymous people who are sometimes directing me to things that I'm able to independently verify, ideally pointing me towards documents or tips. And in that case, you can use someone anonymous. They end up not being part of the story because you just write about what you found out. But, I try to chase down any credible lead I can. I'll give you one dark story of that, if no one minds. It was Christmas Eve, and I believe this had to be Christmas Eve 2018, because Jamal Khashoggi had just been killed. And
yes, he was the Saudi Arabian columnist who wrote for the Washington Post, and he was murdered and dismembered in Turkey.
In the Saudi embassy in Turkey.
Yes.
And it has pretty much come out that this was a Saudi government operation. This was in the fairly immediate aftermath of this. And I received on one of my anonymous tip channels what appeared to be pictures of essentially the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. With the anonymous tipster pointing out that the shirts of one of the individuals in the pictures matched surveillance images of the killer. This was some pretty dark stuff. I spent a day working on it and going through these images, and basically ended up finding that it was gruesome images that had been posted by a Mexican cartel, and they had been online earlier, and someone had happened to be wearing the same shirt. So it was a total bad lead, a total misleading thing, a horrific rabbit hole to go down. And it was a perfect example of why we can't just take anything anyone sends in, because, there's bad actors out there. There's people trying to inject stuff into the bloodstream. And I think that's part of what's going on with, some of these propaganda outlets. They're taking random stuff that's coming in on Twitter and saying, someone told me. That's not an anonymous source. That's sort of the president's dark vision of what an anonymous might be. But you can read the stories on John Barron when he was pretending to be his own publicist. I mean, I spent 2 years working on a gossip page for Richard Johnson, who was sort of the founder of Page Six. Trump used to call him every day. Trump knows very well what it is to be a source and an anonymous source. As Ben pointed out, he has himself been one at many different points. And, I would say by and large, most reporters deal with that fairly responsibly. And anonymity is actually about helping people who want to blow a whistle tell you a story. It's not about hiding things from you.
Well, and I think another aspect of that's important is this idea that journalists investigate things. Sometimes journalists even know things that they can't report. So, there's this idea that if there are allegations against Biden, for example, the media is not going to cover it because, they're anti-Trump and they're pro-Biden. But the fact that the New York Times or the Washington Post or Yahoo hasn't reported on the substance of an allegation does not necessarily mean that there are not reporters trying to investigate it, right?
Yeah, and let me just, not to jump ahead of Ben, but let me just give you a good example of sort of reporters knowing things and not being able to report it. It was kind of conventional wisdom assumed, rumored, known, whatever you want to term it, for ages that Biden was going to pick particularly Ron Klain as his chief of staff, and also Anthony Blinken as his Secretary of State. I had that from a couple different sources, but all of them were saying they were pretty sure it wasn't at that standard of confirmation, and I just couldn't report it. I'm not going to name names because I haven't had enough wine to be that petty, but there was a certain reporter in DC who, as these cabinet picks were coming out, said something like, I totally knew it was going to be Janet Yellen and almost wrote it for Treasury, but I didn't do that. Right. And it's like, that's not how it works. Right. There's knowing the rumor, there's knowing something with a decent degree of certainty, but we really do ideally and hopefully maintain strong levels of confirmation, because that's about maintaining trust with, I alluded to this when I talked about going into the White House. Like, we're there for people, we're the eyes and ears of the public, and we need to really feel the burden of that and live up to it, ideally.
But, to sort of play devil's advocate there, I think some people would say that the media is abdicating its responsibility to the public by not reporting on allegations. Is it a sort of censorship if you say, well, we don't know if this is true, so we're not going to report on it? Or does the public have a right to know, even if it can't be confirmed? I mean, this is something that, Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, said about the Hunter Biden documents. He said, I don't know if it's true, but the American people have a right to know about it.
Let me give you an example of that. It might be one that would even satisfy Rudy Giuliani, right? The Trump dossier, the dossier that was published by BuzzFeed, right? That wasn't verified to any traditional standard. In my mind, it shouldn't have been published, certainly not in raw form. Whatever news value they claimed was in it, you could have said, there's a document raking the rounds in DC with salacious rumors about Trump. And even official, BuzzFeed's justification was that John McCain had seen it. Basically, you could say even high-ranking lawmakers have seen this and are passing it among each other, but nothing's been proved. That would have been a better way to report on that than dumping it on the internet wholesale.
Well, and I believe CNN did report on it that way, and then BuzzFeed published the whole thing.
You're right. David Korn of Mother Jones was first to write about it. Others wrote about it more carefully, and then they just sort of dumped it in the interest of basically saying, people are talking about this in DC, that makes it news, and people need to know about these allegations. But the reality is, we have some due process in America. And there are legal constraints to journalism of defamation and other things. We're sort of bound to that due process, and not every allegation deserves to be floated. I mean, there are aspects of that dossier that to this day are unproven. There are aspects of it that were fully disproven, and they still went into the discourse because people just sort of floated out raw, unconfirmed allegations. And that's personally, I like to err on the side of disclosure. I like to get people as much info as I can, but I want to make sure there's a quality to it as well.
All right. And now, obviously, it's been almost an hour and a half, so I don't want to keep you guys for too long. I know you have important work covering the White House, but I do want to ask you sort of, and I think this was a question we got a little while ago, and Hunter, I believe you've written an article about this, and it's a question on a lot of people's minds, which is, how are things going to change under Biden? Because in some ways, I mean, assuming Biden takes power in January, which seems likely, but, it's a Trump administration, so who the hell knows? But assuming that we do have a Biden administration and we have more of that professional kind of press operation that you saw under especially Obama and to a lesser extent Clinton and George W. Bush, what is it going to be like covering the Biden administration? How will it be different from covering the Trump administration, will we have less transparency? Will it be easier to figure out what's going on, at least at briefing, since people won't be contradicting one another? Just personally, are you planning to remain like a pooler and a White House correspondent during the Biden administration, Hunter?
I mean, I would say for now, definitely. I mean, certainly, I think in these times, like who knows what's next for any of us, but I am starting to cover the transition. I look forward to continue covering Joe Biden. I did do this story with my colleague Brittany Shepard, who covered him on the trail and is sort of joining me in White House coverage, where we looked at how Joe Biden's media operation is going to be different from Trump's. And this was done before he named his press team, but we did, through that kind of sourcing that we were all talking about, sort of have some of the names of who would be involved in that. He ultimately named this all-woman press team, which is, definitely a clear signal from him, and an unprecedented level of diversity on that front. So on the surface level, it's different in that way. In the substantive level, as we were discussing before, there's sort of multiple levels to White House transparency. And when it comes to the briefing, Biden is clearly going to be more transparent than Trump. As Peter and others were saying, Trump got rid of the briefing and press conferences for long stretches. Biden's team has committed to bringing back the briefing. As I was saying, there used to be these freewheeling direct engagements with the president. I do not think that's going to happen under Joe Biden. For that piece, I talked to David Axelrod, who was a senior advisor in the Obama White House. He's about as plugged in as it gets in, Obama-Biden world. And when I asked if Biden would be if we should expect Biden to be holding forth in the Oval and letting reporters toss him questions on the lawn, Axelrod said, and this is a direct quote, "Not a chance, not a chance, not a chance." Biden, he's prone to misstatements, to put it mildly. His campaign has really been guarded both against leaks and at points against access with him. And I think that is going to continue in the Oval. And you will see more of what Ben was talking about, that sort of formal, orchestrated White House presence, rather than, the president letting loose on Twitter and letting loose in his office.
And since Hunter mentioned you, Ben, what do you think? What kinds of changes will we see from the Trump administration to a Biden administration?
Well, I think it's certainly going to be more restrictive in terms of the access that we're not going to have spouting off. But part of it is also going to be what the continuities are, because you can't, reinvent, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And that some of my instinct would be, especially seeing the relative lack of access to Joe Biden during the campaign, which a lot of it had to do with the pandemic. But I think a lot of that is likely to continue, that we'll have a much more sort of efficient messaging operation with even less informal access to the president, and frankly, likely less formal access to the president too. That, of course, Trump was very happy to do some of these sit-down interviews that proved memorable with reporters, and that we'll probably see even less than that, and that there's a tendency going back to the Obama administration of having this in-house White House messaging operation, which we saw with, him doing, creating a White House blog, White House photographer, that I think what we're end up going to see is seeing something even more restrictive, but without the chaos rather, in the anarchy of the Trump administration, that this is going to be the sort of restrictive access of the Trump administration without the wackiness.
And what about, and this is really a question for both of you, or I guess I should say all four of you, because the dog, that's the fourth one, that's the joke. So what about in terms of doing this kind of not reporting on the briefing, not doing the pooling, but trying to get people to tell you things off the record or on background. Do you think we'll see less of those kind of palace intrigue stories?
Yes, I mean, you saw less of the palace intrigue stories in the Biden campaign. That you look at the campaign as the model. That in a lot of ways, the Trump campaign was a model for what the Trump White House would be. And it's safe to say that the Biden campaign is likely to be a model for what the Biden White House would be. That people don't change their managerial skills, their attitudes for the press. That it tends to be a lot of continuity. And I think we'll see less palace intrigue stories, not just because there's less palace intrigue, but that's not the accepted way of dealing with palace intrigue when there is palace intrigue.
Yeah, I would say yes and no. I would agree with Ben that, we have seen much less leaks from the Biden team. They've been much more disciplined. Jen O'Malley Dillon, who was a campaign manager for Biden, I believe, triple check me on this, folks, that she's officially gone into the White House staff as well. Yes. She was very well known for, lauded, frankly, by a lot of campaign staffers for, keeping down leaks and drama and tensions. But I would say two things here as caveats on that. The first is it's easier to do that when things are going well. Right now, Joe Biden has just won an election. He hasn't had to govern yet. And so they've kept down on leaks when essentially, A, the campaign was socially distanced. So a lot of people didn't have a lot of interaction together. And B, they were winning and there wasn't a ton necessarily to argue about. Literally, as I'm saying that, I'm thinking of a story my colleague and I did that was talking about issues Joe Biden faced with the Latino voters in Florida. And that story included complaints and warnings from coalition groups for Cubans that the Biden campaign had made. So, that might be, it's technically not campaign staff, but it was something of a leak from, a campaign coalition, right? And it's a perfect example of my next point, which is good or bad, the level of palace intrigue inside the White House may change. You're not going to have this unprecedented turnover you saw with Trump, with, X numbers of chiefs of staff, of people knifing each other and insulting each other, Scaramucci, going off and cursing people to reporters. You might not see stuff like that, but as reporters, our methodology of reporting on that is the same. So if you take that story that you just highlighted that I did, Peter, talking about Biden's media operation, that has anonymous sources in it, telling us who the players might be. I reached out to Axelrod, again, an Obama world sort of inside-outside figure to get insight, right? We're going to be doing those same things. So the level of drama may decrease, let's see what happens. It's a wild time in history, but I think, will still be reporting on that with a blend of traditional in-person access and, working the phones and finding sources.
Do you think that it will make your job harder? Will it be tougher to get people to tell you things off the record if there's less chaos?
Yes and no, right? Like, as I was saying earlier, when there's a certain level of chaos, you can't trust what people are telling you, right? Also, when you have an administration that's cracking down on leaks and, very adversarial with the news, that doesn't help. Discipline and keeping down leaks and drama doesn't help us either, right?
Yeah.
So I think it kind of remains to be seen, how things play out with Biden. But I think, for me at least, the approach and formula is the same. And one thing I will say is that a fundamental question people have with the transition, right? Reporters were very direct and very challenging to Trump, right? In part because, he, at an unprecedented level, so often said things that were simply lies, right? When I talked about that pool date this month on the 20th, where we got up and shouted at Pence, I said, why are you trying to undermine the democracy? Why are you trying to undermine the democratic election? That is a very confrontational and direct question that I don't think you would have seen in the White House prior to this month in the Trump administration, right? But you also wouldn't have seen need for it.
You do it on your
And
phone.
I think Trump
Really? They need
got
Mirror.
this very directly.
Go on.
And people are wondering if we will lose that under Biden. I would say I certainly don't intend to. And frankly, I hope we don't. I hope we take this, aggressive, direct, and factually challenging style of journalism that was sort of baptized in the Trump White House. And I hope we take it forward because I think it is good for the country. And so if Biden is...
So you'll still be asking those sort of confrontational, direct questions, even if Biden is not, presiding over a pandemic that is killing hundreds of thousands of people?
I mean, the level changes, right? You don't ask someone, why are you undermining the democracy if they're not standing there, raising baseless allegations of voter fraud and undermining the democracy and, trying to literally, with Trump's legal challenges, it's very important we all recognize this. They have by and large failed and they haven't been serious to some extent, but they've been very serious to another extent because the president and all the sources talking to us reporters have made clear if he was able to pull off a power grab, if he was able to null and void the election, he would do so. This was a sincere power grab that was ineptly done, right? So that, requires a level of volume and a level of seriousness to the question that I think, something smaller doesn't. But whatever it is that Biden does, even if it's not, large-scale separation of children from their parents, even if it's not falsely declaring victory in an election, I would like to hope that we're still asking direct and aggressive questions. And when people on Twitter and in the public have gotten angry at me at points, when I mentioned this earlier in the conversation, but when Trump left the hospital, I asked him, are you concerned you've been a super spreader? Now, that was based on the number of events at the White House that proved to have caused large outbreaks. I think it was a fully reasonable question. But what I said to them is, you know what? If Joe Biden screws up, as long as I'm on that lawn, I'll be shouting loud questions at him too. And that is my plan 100%.
Now, the last thing I want to ask you both, Ben, I'm talking to you too, before I let you go, is there a risk of people in the Trump administration, not so much Trump himself, but insiders in the Trump administration, using the media to kind of launder their reputations, serving as anonymous sources, telling things to the media, and therefore getting very positive coverage or distancing themselves from some of the bad things that the Trump administration does? Like, there is a general belief among a lot of political reporters and people who kind of watch this stuff closely that Ivanka and Jared like to anonymously tell reporters that they, in private, disapprove of all the terrible things that Trump is doing. I think there's been some concern, Bannon likes to talk to the press, Kellyanne Conway, and then do they get nicer or more sympathetic coverage than others in Trump world? So how do you kind of balance that desire to tell people what is happening with the desire not to allow people who have been complicit in what the Trump administration has done to distance themselves?
I'll jump on some of this, and then as we're finishing up, and let Hunter take the last word. And just before you start, Ben, I will once again remind everyone that if you have any questions for Ben and Hunter, two professional White House reporters, now is the time to ask them. If you're on Haps, put them in the chat. If you're on Reddit or Twitter or Facebook, reply to the video. We really want all your questions. We don't just want it to be Beluga Blues 10, who is asking all the questions.
They're dominating the whole show, man.
Yeah, I just would note that the people you named aren't exactly models of laudatory press coverage that no one's having. There's not going to be a parade in Ivanka Trump's honor, or Steve Bannon has his own issues right now. That to the extent some of this, I feel like this is all sort of folks getting themselves worked up with their own bigger questions and own bigger concerns about how they think folks are going. But I think everyone has to do their job, and the coverage tends to reflect the facts on the ground. That that you can't tell the story that you're the secret resistance hero, and you're not at the end of the day. That these things you can't keep that type of hustle going for 4 years. And I don't think of anyone who's done that. I think almost the counterexample of this is the Miles Taylor, the anonymous whistleblower came forward, who has been repeatedly attacked for his role with family separation at DHS, and that even someone who's openly coming forward saying I oppose this is still bearing fair and accurate having to account for their actions within the administration and what they've done. So I don't think that's particularly a concern, and I think there's none of these folks are going to have particularly parades in their honor, and they all have had issues with what's going on. And obviously everyone tries to manipulate press coverage to some extent or another, even not manipulating it as a form of manipulation. But I think everyone, I don't think this sort of thing is going to make much of a difference at the end of the day, and everyone just does their jobs.
And Hunter, what do you think?
I mean, to one extent, Ben took the words out of my mouth with Miles Taylor. I think that's a great example of someone who maybe tried to do something like this. And it didn't work, but on the other hand, I think that book sold pretty well. So they certainly enriched themselves in one level. Listen, I always tell people and tell my sources that they're better off talking to me. And let me tell you, we got 1,400 people here in the HAPS broadcast studio. If you work in government, you should absolutely talk to me and tell me your deepest feelings and secrets. It is
and talk to Ben.
And sometimes talk to Ben, but talk to me first. And the reason you should do that is because, I do maintain that off-record thing. If I say it's off-record, it is. If I say it's on background, it is. And it's impossible for a reporter to understand your perspective or to put it in a story if you don't talk to us at all. On the other hand, there are limits to that, right? And, I can't laud you for something that's not laudable. I can just maybe hint at your rationale, right? Or you turn to the Ivanka and Jared example, and I certainly think people close to them, people, on their staff or friends and allies of theirs have tried to manage coverage for them. I mean, but for me personally, what I'm trying to say is that a lot of times when I see folks on Twitter very confidently asserting how they think a story took place or guessing about a source, the times I've known the real source, 9 times out of 10, those people are wrong. And it's really easy for everyone to feel like an armchair expert. But frankly, like with Jared and Ivanka, if they called me personally to push something, I wouldn't be able to say sources close to Jared. So I'm not really, I don't think it works exactly as the Twitterati thinks it does. And I'll give one last example of this. I recently broke the story that the Trump campaign was laying off people, even as the president was maintaining that the election was very much ongoing and that he was still fighting it. The Trump campaign did speak to me on background, campaign sources, and they made the case that this was just sort of normal turnover. There is normal turnover after the campaign. I think the story was probably better for them injecting that point in there further than I might have on my own, but it still didn't undermine the central tenet. Like, you can say this is normal turnover, but due to the president's unprecedented refusal to concede, this is not a normal campaign. And those layoffs that might be normal another time undermined that. right? So I think that central issue and message still got across to people, even though I reached out to them and gave them fair space and did let them say, hey, we see this turnover as normal.
And one final thing about sort of the limits of sources who talk to reporters. You mentioned that if people talk to you off the record, you will respect that. They talk to you on background, you're not going to identify them. But are there limits to that? If someone lies to you off the record, will you burn that source?
I won't unless there's sort of specific reasons to. So Hunter might differently. It depends, and it's all sort of circumstantial and fact based too. But I'm not unwilling to do it if it's dependent. Yeah, but it's all circumstantial, and it's all sort of based on what it is and what it is. Hunter, I get to the feeling may just go straight to being nuclear.
Well, I mean, I think Ben is completely right. Like, as we were saying before, all of these standards are subjective for an individual reporter. For me, I almost view it as like sort of a therapist or a doctor, right? Mm-hmm. Let's just say, theoretically, I'm kind of a comic nerd. Let's say I talk to Dr. Doom, and Dr. Doom tells me off record, I will use my death ray tomorrow, right? I am screaming that from the rooftops and identifying the source. If people's lives are in danger, it's a certain level of seriosity. In my mind, there is no ethical cover that a reporter can provide there. But broadly, I really do respect that stuff. I think if someone totally lied and burned me, I've never had it happen, in part because I try to be careful about these things. And again, use those multiple layers of confirmation. If there was sort of an orchestrated campaign to dupe me or like serve me fake documents or whatever, I probably would go nuclear and out those people. Also one time in my career, I had a story where I had a scoop on something. I was hitting up a government office about it. I gave them a deadline. I went past the deadline multiple times, and they said to me, well, you need to wait for us because otherwise we'll just go to the New York Times. And I said, I'm publishing in 5 minutes. And I did so. Now, I didn't out any off-record conversations, but I basically no longer afforded them that opportunity to, get their narrative into the story because I'd afforded it to them for more time than I was willing to. So, yeah, I think that's an interesting thing. One thing I will say here, I love this show. I love how nitty gritty you've gotten with this stuff, Peter. I love that you're just throwing in one more question. We're this is how you know that Peter is a good journalist. A good journalist, just keeps throwing in extra questions all the time. So you guys got to make sure to watch the Stern Look. This is, I think, a really unique look into the real how the sausage gets made, nitty gritty of this business, and really no one knows it better or asks kind of sharper questions about the process than Peter Stern. So me and Pablo over here, we endorse the Stern Look.
All right, thank you. No, but really, thank you so much, Hunter and Ben, not just for spending so much time with our viewers and going into so much detail on what it's actually like to be a White House reporter, but also for agreeing to come on for the debut show of the Stern Look. I'm very happy that you two and other people who I've reached out to have been willing to take a chance and come on here and share their experience and their knowledge about what it means to be a journalist with the general public. With that, I will finally let you guys go and wrap up. I hope that the 1,400 people tuning in enjoyed this episode. Be sure to tune in next week at 6 p.m. Eastern. Well, we might get started a few minutes late again. So around 6 p.m. Eastern for the next episode of The Stern Look. If you're enjoying the show, I'd encourage you to join HAPS. It's haps.tv. You can join for free, and then you can leave comments. You can help me decide what questions to ask our guests in real time. Thank you for that comment, Hunter, which I'm putting on the screen now. And if you join HAPS, you'll also be able to directly support the show by becoming a monthly sponsor, because Stern Look is entirely viewer supported. So if you enjoy the show and you're able to, I'd really appreciate it if you could become a monthly sponsor at $5 a month. If you have any questions or suggestions of topics you want me to cover on the show, feel free to email me at sternlook@gmail.com. That's STERNELOOK@gmail.com. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Peter Stern, and to follow the show on Twitter at SternLook. And I'm sure you want to hear more from our wonderful guests. So if you want to follow Ben and Hunter, you can follow them on Twitter as well. Ben is at Ben C. Jacobs, and Hunter is at Hunter W. Thanks again for tuning in.